Today, I'm joined by Dr. Joanna Clifton-Sprigg, who is a lecturer and assistant professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Bath. Joanna's research interests are in labour and gender economics, migration, and the economics of education. She's also the chair of the GW4 Maternity Leave Network, which brings together academics from Bath, Bristol, Cardiff, and Exeter universities. So, welcome, Joanna.
Good morning.
So, I wanted to ask you about your study of the UK Shared Parental Leave scheme, which was introduced in 2015. And your study started with a simple question: did it work? So my first question is, what's the short answer to that question?
I think the short answer is probably not, or not to the extent one would expect. But it comes with quite a lot of qualifiers, which I'm guessing we'll explore in this conversation.
It would be a very short interview, wouldn't it, if we just left it there? Okay, so first of all, can you explain how you defined whether it worked and you know what you did to explore that question?
Of course. So we really considered whether the policy rollout had an effect on take-up by fathers, so number of fathers taking leave in general, and then also on the length of leave taken if they have taken leave, so assuming they have taken leave. We look at this, we consider this applying quasi-experimental methods called regression discontinuity in time. Now, without going into technicalities, the approach allows us to determine a causal link between the policy implementation and then behavior of eligible fathers. To do this, we use quantitative data. So we used a survey, UK Household Longitudinal Survey. That survey follows about 40,000 households annually every year. So we observe them over time. And we can, in this data set, link the members of the household, which was crucial for our analysis. So in particular, we can look at newborn children appearing in the data and then link them to both parents and the parents' work experience as well. So we started by looking at households who had new children and then focused on identifying those who we think hypothetically could use the policy. So essentially, we narrow down to households where both parents are a couple, because that best approximates involved parenting, let's say, and then they're both working and have been continuously employed between the 2 points in time when they've been interviewed and when the baby appears in the data. That's the best we could do to mimic being eligible for the policy. And we do this also for parents who had a child before the policy was in place, because the approach will be then comparing the group of parents who would have been very potentially eligible had the policy been implemented earlier to parents who did have it at hand and could have used it. So then the method really compares behavior of average group of parents defined within these parameters. So narrowed down to those who we think could have used the policy. And we do this because we're trying to attempt to eliminate anything else that would have affected the uptake or the length of leave that we observe in the data. We're trying to isolate the effect of policy itself. So this is quite involved technically, but that's in essence what it's attempting to do. We don't really, in the data set, we don't see the type of leave the parent has taken. So even though we're starting by looking at uptake and we find no change in behavior there, we also then consider the length of leave because we think that might be a better way of considering responses to this policy. Because already before shared parental leave fathers could have taken also paternity leave, which is another form of leave available. So if parents change their behavior in response to this policy, we assume we would have seen also change in the length of leave the fathers were potentially taking. But we don't find an effect there either.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in the data you're looking at, how is leave recorded?
So the parents are asked whether they have taken leave related to the child being born. And I think in the last wave of data, so after 2021, this has been refined. But until then, the first question is whether you've taken any leave related to your child being born. And that could be various forms of leave. But conveniently, it's followed up with two questions about specific dates that this leave has taken place. So the parents are asked to define the start and then end date of that leave period. So we can then look at length of leave taken. Okay.
So it's not a simple task of, that a question is asked, did you take shared parental leave, and so on. But so you're almost being like detectives and kind of finding, okay, so you're looking for changes in the extent to which parents are reporting that they took leave at the right time, and comparing that to what happened with parents who didn't have access to this possibility.
Yes, exactly. So we're looking at changes in these particular variables. We're assuming that nothing else has changed over that time. So we're comparing the two groups and then looking at the difference.
Yeah. And so basically you found no significant difference.
No, that's right.
Okay, interesting. So now I know that you then went on to do even more kind of detective work and to look at particular subgroups who were of particular interest. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, we didn't want to do the policy injustice, and we have seen quite a lot of work prior to ours that's based on quite often interviews or focus groups. We've also seen studies from other countries and the government or civil service pre-impact assessment, pre-policy impact assessment, sorry. And these were signaling to us that perhaps no one ever expected an effect to apply to an average household as such, but maybe some groups were more likely to take up the policy, particularly at the beginning. So we started by looking at financial constraints, because we thought that with statutory payments whilst on leave being typically much lower than the household income, perhaps, and household heads quite often, or fathers being the higher earner in the family, perhaps this is really about a financial decision. Households might not be able to afford the leave. So for that, we zoom in on households that reported having higher than average overall income, whether it was gross or net. And then we also look at couples where the difference between the father's and mother's income is smaller than average, thinking that that's an easier decision in terms of foregoing income. And then lastly, we also looked at couples, that was a very small subgroup, where the mother earned actually more than the father. That was one angle we explored. But we also thought that perhaps some occupations might, for parents in some occupations, it might be easier to take leave or use some sort of flexible approach to work. So we also considered subgroups by occupations, and then zoomed in on particularly on professionals and associate professionals. These tend to be quite often office jobs that might also have an option of job sharing. They're a bit more flexible. And lastly, we looked by education levels, because the literature in economics, but also in other disciplines, suggests that higher educated parents might prioritize or make their decisions to share leave might be influenced by factors other than financials. They just might forego income, wanting to be really involved in child's life right from the start. So we also looked at fathers who completed higher tertiary education, and then also couples where both parents have graduated from university. We don't really find strong effects on any of these subgroups. If anything, we find a marginally statistically significant effect for parents who both graduated from university, and it's only on the length of leave. So there is a slight signal that perhaps these couples might have, in their cases, the fathers might have slightly extended their leave. But I would also take that with a lot of caution, because the result is marginally statistically significant, which means that the imprecision around it, the extent of error, is fairly large. So we don't want to overemphasize this result, although it does seem to be quite robust to a series of checks.
Okay. And I mean, I guess also some of that might be the result of parents having some other sort of enhanced leave offer from their employers, which may or may not have involved shared parental leave, I guess.
Yes, it is possible. I think quite often the educational level and occupational one has these outcomes are quite often correlated, so it's difficult to be sure what would be driving this result. So that's another reason for caution. I agree.
I guess there is evidence out there, different sorts of evidence about the impact of shared parental leave at the kind of individual and couple level. So, you know, qualitative work showing, you know, that in families that have been able to take shared parental leave, it, you know, they report it having been often quite transformative. So I suppose, so you're, although on some level your study is saying, you know, shared parental leave didn't work or hasn't worked, you're not saying that at that sort of family level, it can't have brought benefits, are you?
No, of course not. I agree. This is a quantitative method that we're applying here. So what we're doing is we're comparing cohorts of parents, controlling for anything that we can see about them in the survey data. It's at a large sample level. This is not the same as saying individuals haven't benefited. So we just don't find a sizable enough effect on an average household. That's how I would put it. Yeah. There will be households, as you said, who have taken this up, and from them quite often we'd have testimonials of this perhaps being a challenge, but also a very positive experience by and large. But there are just probably not enough of these couples for this to transpire in a quantitative analysis. That does not negate any of the research that we've been kind of mentioning, suggesting that when parents do take the leave, this is beneficial to them. I think these are complementary in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess, you know, we're looking for a leave system that brings those benefits, aren't we? And I guess what your study brings is a kind of macro level analysis that suggests, you know, this system isn't delivering what we would want
not on
to.
scale. Yes, exactly. So if it's it's sort of looking from an implementer's perspective of if you're implementing a policy, you would like this to be used, and there is no evidence that it has been used on a large scale.
Yeah. So you in your paper, you've made some recommendations for how the SPL policy might be improved. Can you tell us what those recommendations are?
Indeed, we make some recommendations that come from a combination of our work, but also research of others, and also from consultations with our advisory board, members of which are quite often practitioners. And we think that one of the real obstacles in this policy is really financial. So a lot of it comes down to financial compensation. And we have seen this in the analysis. So as soon as we started narrowing down to identifying potentially eligible couples, we've lost quite a big sample. Yeah. But also research from other countries that implemented shared parental leave or daddy months or any policies that are slightly different to maternity leave. They're not just assigning leave to mothers. The ones that have been successful are fairly generously paid in kind of percentage terms of wages, and for a sufficiently long time. And we think that financial constraint is really strong in this case. So households with lower incomes just do not access the policy, even if they're eligible for that reason. And the second one is eligibility criteria themselves. So that particularly the constraint on the requirement of fairly long service with the employer before the child is born is another one that probably means a lot of households do not even consider the policy just because they do not qualify. So loosening one of these criteria would probably be helpful as well. And from interactions with practitioners, we also understand that the practical implementation, even for eligible couples, is complicated because it involves both employers being on board and understanding the policy and the legal framework around it. This can be off-putting as well. But I think that's a slightly smaller obstacle compared to the eligibility and the financial constraints.
So, I mean, if the government were to take on board your recommendations, would you expect that to have a significant impact on the take-up?
I think this is a tricky question. It's very difficult to predict at the outset. If we learned anything in the process, it's that the devil is in the detail. So it's really about how this would be then set up. And I think what would be welcome at this stage is an in-depth analysis of various scenarios that would potentially improve on what we have at the moment. And this could have variants of pay levels and the length of leave, as well as I think there is a question as well whether this should be solely leave that's assigned to fathers rather than shared between parents. If I was to comment on the intuition that I have, kind of my prior intuition on this, I would expect that the biggest element would be the removing of the financial barrier. That would increase the interest for sure in the policy. Whether this is sufficient, perhaps it would also require some incentives for fathers to start with to overcome any reluctance to take it, just because we've had maternal leave policy and an unsuccessful shared leave policy for so long that perhaps an information campaign or something to incentivize families to try this would also be required. But I always encourage in-depth analysis because with a lot of policies, not just this one, we see that it might have unintended consequences. So to trying to predict, setting out clearly who we want to reach with it, and then trying to predict whether the setup that we're considering works for that particular group would be essential.
Because I mean, this model that we have and that you've been studying, the shared parental leave scheme, is very unusual, actually, isn't it? In the sense that you know, it's actually transferable maternity leave rather than you know, reserved parental leave for each parent. And so I guess when you look at the other evidence out there, you're looking at, in fact, at something that's rather different. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, we actually, this is correct. We have found it very difficult to find studies that are that would be a good benchmark for our work, which is what you would normally do in research. You'd compare your results to a benchmark of some kind, because most policies are different. Particularly if you look at Nordic countries that pioneered typically daddy months, although they have sharing policies as well. Their context is very different. But increasingly as well, we have seen an implementation of father-specific leave in European Union in the past 3 to 4 years. And this has been quite interesting and informative as well, because it does show actually that you could have a prescribed policy and then have very different implementation depending on the country, with disincentives, I would say, built into the system, perhaps just by pure coincidence or lack of kind of foresight in it. But none of them really do sharing as such. As you said, they typically go down the line of assigning leave to fathers or giving fathers an option to take longer leave. In practice, I think there is a bit of a political question. If you do this, does that mean you curtail the maternity leave policy? I think, and that's a difficult one to approach. It has obviously cost implementations, but I think taking something away from citizens would be a difficult one to implement, but might be one that many countries have been considering if they are expanding the rights of fathers to leave.
Yeah. Yes, it's very complex. And I mean, it feels to me like one of the intrinsic problems with the shared parental leave system is that for the father to, there are a lot of hoops for a father to get through before he actually takes that leave. And your study shines a light on all of those, you know, whether they're eligible in the first place, whether they can afford, whether the family can afford for him to take that leave because of the rate it's paid at. And also, crucially, whether the mother is okay about giving up some of her leave, which is the way that the system in the UK is set up. It's very much that it's her leave and she can choose or not to pass some or almost all of it to him. So, and that bit, that is the unusual bit, I guess, in the UK. So yes, how does one unpick that is the question.
Well, with our data, we can't. So we don't see the decision-making process, which is tricky. We can focus on the work aspects of the households, and we can explore what they did before we can observe what they did as a household before the baby appears and after, and draw some inferences. But there isn't a question on their views about sharing or the form of sharing that's available in the UK right now. This has been explored by some other researchers as I said, in interviews with couples or in focus groups. I think it probably transpires somewhere there in conversations, but that's not something we can definitely shed light on at this stage. It would be very interesting to know, particularly if it was to be redesigned as a policy.
Yeah. Okay, just widening out the conversation a bit. So like why does this matter? Like from your point of view, I guess, you know, you will have done this research. You will have been motivated to do this research in some way. And I'm guessing it's to do with gender equality and closing the gender pay gap and so on. But I'm interested to hear sort of where this came from and why you feel that it matters.
I think it's very important to consider whether parents have an opportunity to share and then take it up for an array of reasons. So firstly, I think anecdotally, we are increasingly seeing in the UK, but also in other developed economies, that parents want to do this. So we are seeing a cultural shift where fathers want to be involved and don't always have maybe the opportunity to do so, depending on the legal system in place. But also an increasing number of research papers in economics and in other fields as well is showing clear links between parental involvement and child development. That's not something that we really consider here, but we know that if both parents are involved, there will be benefits to the child. They're also looking, and that's more what you're asking probably about, return to labor market or to work. And we know that taking time out when a child is born is particularly hurtful from career point of view for women. There is plenty of evidence that there is of child penalty affecting wages, career progression, particularly for highly skilled employees. And there is also this search for an optimal length of leave that would minimize that harm. And we currently think that sharing and fathers taking some of that leave on themselves would help with that as well, because there is less evidence that fathers are actually experiencing the same degree of penalty when they have a child as mothers do. So yes, we think that there isn't yet a good solution for balancing work and having children or family commitments. And one suggestion is that greater sharing will help with that. That obviously then translates into potentially economic growth and improvements in productivity. So there is also an economic argument to be made for the government to consider, rather than just kind of individual work goals as such.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation.